freedom.
Oh. We want freedom by any means necessary. We want justice by any means necessary. We want equality by any means necessary. We don't feel that in 1964, living in a country that is supposedly based upon freedom and supposedly the leader of the free world, we don't think that we should have to sit around and wait for some segregationist congressmen and senators and a president from Texas in Washington, D.C. to make up their mind that our people are due now some degree of civil rights. No, we want it now, or we don't think anybody should have it.
Throughout history, African Americans have experienced racism, oppression, and prejudice. Beginning with slavery in the 1600s, or even earlier as some may argue, people around the world viewed Africans as uncivilized and inferior. Slavery lasted for many centuries, with its end beginning on January 1, 1863, during the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation to free all slaves in the Confederacy. The end of the American Civil War would result in the ratification of the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865, which would finally abolish slavery. Although the late 1800s saw the betterment of African Americans in society, such as them gaining citizenship and the right to vote, they would still suffer from hardships and poor treatment. A movement soon began in which African Americans advocated and fought for better treatment. In this documentary, we will discuss how the Civil Rights Movement began, African Americans' limited rights and how they fought to expand them, and how the Civil Rights Movement transformed the American identity and America's culture and society.
Some may say that the Civil Rights Movement began in 1955 when Rosa Parks' arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, but to truly understand its causes and how it began, we must explore further back into history. During the Reconstruction Era, slavery was abolished, and the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, giving African American citizenship and the right to vote. During this time period, many people were trying to restrict the freedom of blacks through literacy tests, poll taxes, the cropulation system, and black codes. Laws were passed in several states requiring blacks to have employment, and if they didn't, they could be forced to work on a plantation. Northerners began supporting blacks after they realized that these laws were unconstitutional. This led to a time in which blacks had an increased involvement in politics and society. Along with these victories came along civil unrest among other whites. Supremacists wanted to maintain the antebellum South, and new organizations like the Ku Klux Klan were created. These groups targeted those who were a threat to white authority regardless of color, and they led to the waning support of Reconstruction. Reconstruction ended with a compromise of 1876, where Republicans and Democrats agreed to deem Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president in exchange for acknowledging Democratic control and removing federal troops in the South. Blacks continued to face more challenges with the birth of Jim Crow laws and several court cases that oppressed them even further. In Plessy v. Ferguson and Cumming v. Board of Education, the court held and maintained the principle of separate but equal. Several spokesmen for African Americans also began to rise. Booker T. Washington believed that African Americans should attend school, learn a craft and trade, and adopt the standards of the white middle class, and then they can win the respect of the white population. Another reformer was W.E.B. Du Bois, who had opposing views to Washington in terms of the goals of his race. Du Bois argued that blacks should aspire to the professions and they should fight for their civil rights instead of waiting for them to be granted. In 1909, Du Bois, along with other progressives, formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP began to win victories in the Supreme Court in cases like Gwynn v. United States, where the court deemed the Grandfather Clause, which limited African Americans' right to vote, unconstitutional. Unfortunately, Du Bois died in 1963 in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, only a day before Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. These groups and their attempts to create racial equality paved the way for further attempts and sparked the Civil Rights Movement. The 20th century proved to be the most eventful for the Civil Rights Movement. On July 26, 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, in which he stated, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." Several years later, on 1954, In Brown v. Board of Education, justices came to the conclusion that racial segregation of youth in public schools was unconstitutional. This case established that separate but equal wasn't actually equal. Earl Warren, a justice on the committee, wrote, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently unequal." Although these cases and legislations were victories for blacks, they were still feeling oppression and were even being killed. On August 17, 1955, a 14-year-old boy, Emmett Till, was kidnapped, beaten, shot, and dumped in the Tallahatchie River for allegedly whistling at a white woman. The men responsible, J.W. Milliam and Roy Bryant, were arrested, but acquitted by an all-white jury. They later bragged about the murder. Blacks continued to protest and fight for equality, and on December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, a black woman, refused to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. She was arrested, and her imprisonment inspired the Montgomery bus boycott, which led to other boycotts and protests that soon brought down the Jim Crow laws. In the coming years, civil rights leaders came together, and in 1957, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, made up of Martin Luther King Jr., Charles K. Steele, and Fred L. Shuttlesworth, was established. The SCLC had a principle base of nonviolence and civil disobedience. The leading figure of this group, MLK, believed that it was important that the civil rights movement not sink to the level of the racists and oppressors.
On February 1st, 1960, 4 young black men sat at a whites-only lunch counter and were denied service in Greensboro, North Carolina. They still refused to leave until they were served. They sat there all day until the restaurant closed at night, inspiring a movement in which they came back the next day with hundreds of other college-level students. Word spread of their actions, and many more individuals nearby were inspired to do the same at other local businesses with the same policy. A year later, the Supreme Court stated that segregation of interstate transportation methods was unconstitutional in Boynton versus Virginia. This sparked a protest group known as the Freedom Riders. While on a bus, they were surrounded by whites and attacked. Images of the bus on fire and the bloodied members of the bus circulated through the newspaper, causing an uproar in the civil rights community, inspiring many others to follow in the Freedom Riders' footsteps. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. would give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. With nearly 250,000 people in attendance at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., MLK cemented his place in history by delivering one of the most famous and moving speeches ever to be recorded. He brilliantly used repetition and alluded to things including Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and verses from the Bible. In 1964, the civil rights community finally received what they had been fighting so hard for. With the passing of the Civil Rights Act, segregation and discrimination were banned. A year later, the Voting Rights Act was passed, a bill prohibiting the use of literacy tests. In 1967, the Supreme Court case Loving v. Virginia banned the prohibition of interracial couples. All 3 of these bills were huge in the fight for equality amongst African Americans. They marked the first of 2 events that would bring an end to the civil rights movement in the 1900s. The other event wouldn't be seen as a win. On April 4th, 1968, while standing on his hotel balcony, MLK was shot by James Earl Ray. He was rushed to the hospital where he died an hour later. With his death, the civil rights movement lost their prominent leader and began to slow down.
Blacks fought for many centuries to obtain rights that allowed racial equality among Americans. The prominent figures of the 1900s led the blacks over obstacles and challenges that slowly but surely gave way for new changes in our government's laws and policies that expanded their freedom. The impact of the civil rights movement can be seen today, as many Americans are involved in politics regardless of race or color. Today we are a thriving and prosperous country that does not condone any prejudice, racism, or oppression upon others, and where everyone has the freedoms and rights stated by our Constitution.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to reign, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spirit, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.